Hey guys, and welcome to a special video. In this video I'm going to be ranking all of the solo bosses in RuneScape 3 using a tier list. So when you're ready, grab your cup of tea, sit back, relax and enjoy. Some important information before I start off the video. All of these bosses are ranked from my perspective as someone who is decent at PvM and a max player with tier 90s, curses, overloads and perked out gear. So just to clarify, some bosses I may call easy or very easy and put them down at D and E tier are just easy for me as a max player. That doesn't mean necessarily that they will be easy for you as a mid-level player. An example of this would be QBD without super anti-fires at low combat stats is extremely hard compared to doing it with maxed combat stats, tier 90s and super anti-fire potions or searing overloads. With that being said though, let's just quickly go over how I'm going to be ranking the bosses. I'm going to be ranking the bosses by using a tier list, with E being the easiest and S being the hardest bosses. I'll be ranking the bosses using this tier list because ranking the bosses individually is just too hard and there are too many factors and different mechanics you can't really compare to each other. See S tier bosses as extremely hard. You have to be flawless and execute the combat abilities perfectly while knowing all the mechanics and also dealing good damage to the boss, meaning your DPM is good. Otherwise you'll have a very hard time killing these bosses. Also, if you can comfortably kill all of the bosses on the S tier list, you can call yourself a very good PvMer. A tier bosses are bosses I consider to be challenging. You have to know all of the mechanics and be able to do good damage. With some practice and some skill, you should be able to do all of the bosses on the A tier list. B tier bosses are bosses I consider to be medium to hard depending on your gear setup. You have to know some of the mechanics, especially the instant kill mechanics or the highly punishing ones, and just do decent damage and face tank all of the mistakes that do not instant kill you. So big hits, you just munch up through your food tick eating and you should be fine. Though that doesn't mean you're efficiently killing the boss. C tier bosses are bosses I consider normal to medium. You have to know some of the mechanics and just do okay damage. You can face tank all of your mistakes, much like with the B tier. D tier bosses are bosses I consider to be easy. All you have to do is do damage, eat some food when you take damage, and know minimal mechanics depending on the boss. E tier bosses are bosses I could call, well, not even bosses per se, but just very easy monsters with high HP. Just do damage and eat food. Really, some of the bosses on this tier will be free to play bosses. With that being said, let's get into the actual tier list. The E tier bosses include bosses I consider to be very easy as a max player. Gold Wars Dungeon 1 bosses like Kriara, Bandos, Zilyana and Krill, King Black Dragon, Calphite Queen, the Giant Mole, Chaos Elemental, Barrows, and Jad. Jad is subjective and could be seen as D tier because you actually have to prayer flick to kill Jad, which is a bit harder compared to, let's say, killing the Giant Mole or KBD, but generally speaking, Jad can be done on low level accounts even, level 50 range and defense and just safe spots, so Jad really isn't that hard anymore nowadays. I know I said I wouldn't be ranking the bosses individually within a tier, but Bandos, Kriara and Jad are definitely the hardest bosses within this tier. The D tier of solo bosses include God Wars Dungeon 2 bosses, Queen Black Dragon, God Wars Dungeon 1 hard mode, Legiones, Corporal Beast, and Dagon Kings. Dagon Kings nowadays don't really make up for much of a challenge for main accounts if you're farming all three using War Priest or Anima Core of Sliske or something, or some other Tribute armor. You can even AFK them, pretty much. You can also just save spot Dagon Rex if you're an Ironman account, just killing that one alone. But, you know, Dagon Kings really aren't much of a boss anymore, I'd say, but they're harder than the E tier bosses. Corporal Beast is also really easy. He pretty much doesn't have any mechanics except for the Shadow Core, which you want to kill, and you just prayer flick from magic to melee. For a maxed account, he's pretty similar to Gogorovic in the fact that you just eat food and do damage, and you're set pretty much. Now, QBD is actually a very good boss to learn mechanics with because it's a mechanic heavy boss, but as a max player with searing overloads, I can just soul split and almost just stand there, activate the artifacts, you know, kill the tormented souls and just keep going, and QBD just If you don't have super anti-fires or searing overloads, QBD is very hard. But in my position, QBD is very easy, and I don't even have much kills. Like, I've never properly tried this boss, but it's really easy for me. That being said though, if you're practicing, you want to use the flame walls and go for the gaps or search through them and stuff, there is more to this boss. Like I said, a mechanic heavy boss and a very good way of practicing PvM and getting better at PvM by killing this boss before you go up tiers. As for Legiones, you just run around, avoid the lightning and do damage, I guess. Not even joking. As for God Rush Dungeon 1 hard mode, it is actually quite hard if you're a lower level player, but as a high level player, if you just run around, aka kiting, especially at Bandos with the falling rocks, you should be good. Kriara hard mode, so Armadillo isn't really that much harder either. They just have more HP, they have some special things that spawn, so Kriara, there's the tornadoes, but from my perspective, I wouldn't call it hard mode, just annoying mode. And finally, God Wars Dungeon 2 really isn't that hard, although it's a big step up from God Wars Dungeon 1 as you take much more damage and it's hard to survive a full hour at Gogorovic without Venom Blood and good gear. But generally speaking, Twin Furies, Vindicta, Hellware aren't that hard, so that's why they are located at D tier. At C tier, we are getting into some higher level content, being Elite Dungeons 2 bosses like the Blackstone Dragon, Astellarn and Veracliffe, the first Elite Dungeons 3 boss, the Crusacian Leviathan, or however you pronounce that, Harakan, aka the Fight Kill minigame, and the Magister boss. Now the bosses of Elite Dungeons 2 aren't per se hard, and the footage you're watching on the screen is actually my first time soloing Elite Dungeons 2. The bosses just take a bit of time, and you need to know some of the mechanics to properly kill the boss, otherwise you'll get instant killed or punished heavily. But as long as you know how to avoid those mechanics, you should be fine. Veracliffe is a very mechanic heavy boss, but generally one of the easier bosses of Elite Dungeons 2, and the Blackstone Dragon is just a long fight, but probably the easiest boss of Elite Dungeons 2, which is strange. I will say though, the trash mobs of Elite Dungeons 2, like the blobs, the spiders, the magic books, they absolutely shred through me. I use a lot of food. That's probably because I'm not as experienced as I'd like to be with Elite Dungeons 2 just yet, but the trash mobs of Elite Dungeons 2 are the second hardest trash mobs after Elite Dungeons 1, and the easiest trash mobs are definitely found in Elite Dungeons 3. Speaking of Elite Dungeons 3, the Crusacian Leviathan is one of the easiest, if not the easiest boss of Elite Dungeons 3, and that's why it's on C tier. Now this boss really only has a few mechanics, a puke effect or attack which you want to avoid otherwise you'll easily get killed, and a swipe attack which if you're using ranged or magic is also easily avoided. Now in terms of looks, I know this is random, but this boss is probably one of the coolest bosses in RuneScape 3. The scenery, the boss itself, it looks perfect. The next boss is the Magister, which is a boss that requires 109 boosted or 115 Slayer, which is weird because it's really not a very hard boss. It's a boss that hits hard and you can soul split back most of your health, and the only real mechanic is some bombs you want to be avoiding. It's basically a DPS race and you just want to avoid one or two simple mechanics, which is why it's located at C tier, despite the high Slayer requirement, which is still very odd in my eyes. Possibly because it has to do with the Mana Force 120 Slayer expansion. But yeah, if this is one of those bosses you need to tick off your Reaper kill list, go ahead and do it. It's not hard at all if you have a 290 weapon. And finally at C tier we have Harakan, aka the Fight Kill combat minigame. The combat minigame is basically surviving 37 waves of creatures, including multiple Jads, which will have to pray a flick for to kill them, while saving your food for the final boss, because otherwise you'll run out and actually fill the minigame. It's not that hard, but it does require some skill and some knowledge of prayer flicking. And Harakan is just a boss you kill. All you need to do is just not run out of supplies, which is easier said than done for lower level players. But again, as a max player, if you're using obsidian armor and stuff, this really isn't that hard. Moving up to the B tier bosses, you may be surprised that I put Talos 0% at B tier together with Tarakat and Araxor 0%. Now hear me out. Telos really isn't that hard pre 100% Enrage. Now I may have been failing in my video where I try out Telos for the first time, but that's because I went in completely blind, and even then on my first attempt I almost finished the boss. The only reason I didn't make it is because in phase 4 you have an insta-kill mechanic if you don't stand in the right font or bomb area. If it wasn't for that mechanic, I would have finished the boss without using a guide and knowing anything about the boss, just by face tanking and eating through all of the mechanics. And the reason you're not seeing a 0% enrage skill on screen now is because if I showed that footage, it would just show me face tanking completely everything, and since then I have actually become better at Telos by actually trying to avoid mechanics in P1 to P3. But all you really need to do to get that 0% enrage kill is in P4, you stand in the green font, then the red one, and then finally the black one, and then you just finish off Telos pretty much, and you can face tank all of the bombs. As for Tarakat, he's really simple. All you really do is pray magic. If he's not using depth swiftness, you kill the portals, and I usually just kill the small guys solo, then kill the big guys solo, so you take less damage and it's easier. This way the fight is longer, however. If he's using depth swiftness, you just pray ranged against Tarakat, and you just DPS him down. It's an easy fight, really. If you do end up ignoring the big summon zombie guide, you do take a lot more damage, and the boss fight becomes significantly harder, and you'll just be eating a lot more food. I'd say with my gear setup and my average PVM skill, it really isn't that hard, and that's why I'm comparing it to 0% Araxor and 0% Telos. But this is why Tarakat is in B tier. You just need to do decent damage and know some of the mechanics so that you can successfully kill the boss. Oh, and if you're wondering, this is the second boss in Elite Dungeon 3. Next up is a boss that I personally don't like, but the majority of the community does like because it's apparently one of the funnest bosses in the game. It's Araxor, aka Daddy Longlegs, the spider boss in Runescape 3. And Araxor is really good money. I just don't like the mechanics of the boss. I find Acid Path, for example, which I was doing in the video, very annoying. The first time I actually did Araxor was duo, which is apparently much harder than solo. Now, as for Araxor, it's one of those bosses you can actually do with lower tier weaponry and armor. It just takes a while to kill the boss. As long as you know that the instant kill spiders instant kill you, the ones with the blue bar above their heads, and the mirrorback spiders and stuff, you know how to counter them, you should be good to go for pretty much all paths. The final phase is the phase you'll be taking the most damage in, but you can also pray or flick, magic to range depending on the attack of Araxor, and you will be taking less damage. I personally don't have as much experience with this boss as with, let's say, Nex, so that's why I'm taking a lot more damage than I should be taking in the final phase. Next up we have A tier solo bosses, and these bosses will require you to know most of, if not all of the mechanics, do decent damage, have decent gear, and know how to pray or flick and quickly react to certain mechanics. Otherwise you'll have a very, very hard time successfully killing these bosses. The bosses in A tier include Telos 100% and up, aka Telos with phase 5, the extra phase added to it, Godwatch Dungeon 2 Challenge Mode, Nex Solos, Masuta Solo, Saryu Solo, aka Elite Dungeons 1 bosses, pretty much all of them, and the Sanctum Guardian, and KK Solos. Now KK Solos are actually subjective. It depends on your luck. You can easily kill KK solo if you only get mage and ranged phase. If you get melee phase, you'll need a little bit more skill and timing for the greens, but just ranged phase is actually rather easy. Let me just start off by talking about KK, aka Calfight King. Now Calfight King is a boss that you can easily solo nowadays, as long as you know what to do with the greens and how to counter or cancel them. For mage phase, you don't have a green, so you can easily range the Calfight King down. Calfight King will do 2 more auto attacks after that, and if you then use a stun like backhand with melee for example, you actually cancel out the green attack and avoid it completely, so that way you can actually just keep on killing Calfight King. If you get melee phase, Calfight King actually becomes a lot more difficult. Well, Calfight King in general is something between an S and A tier boss. Soloing Calfight King is not per se easy, especially if you want to do it successfully for an entire hour, because this way you will be encountering various different phases. The thing is, with Calfight King, if you do end up failing or mistiming your stuns or to intercept or counter the greens, you will get punished heavily and you will be sent to Death's office. That's why Calfight King solos are pretty hard. Calfight King Duo, on the other hand, I know this is a solo boss tier list, but Duo Trio Calfight King is literally a joke these days. You can do it with low level gear. It's really easy. You just Voke, res the greens as the second player or the greener. It's not that hard really, but solo is pretty difficult, and that's why it's on the A tier list. Next up, in no particular order, we are just going to be talking about Gold Rush Dungeon 2 Challenge Mode. Now, Challenge Mode is just like Gold Rush Dungeon 1 Hard Mode. It isn't really per se challenging, it's just annoying and you end up eating a lot more food. Especially Vindicta is just tedious. You have 3 phases or 3 times the health pool, and the final health pool is just you finishing off Gorvek, and he just spawns so much fire and it sticks longer. He hits harder, and it's just really tedious. But if you know the mechanics of prayer flicking, so melee, ranged melee, for Gorvek's attack rotation, it's not that hard, it's just annoying like I said. And you can see me on screen doing it for the first time actually. I just munch for food like a mad lad. It's really annoying. The other challenge modes are pretty similar. Apparently you can do Hellware without food if you're a bit skilled with the reses, just like Hellware itself. Gold Rush Dungeon 2, normally Hellware is really easy. If you know what you're doing, you can res a lot of hits and save food essentially. Just challenge mode is just annoying, but I can imagine if you don't have maxed gear, you don't have a yak, challenge mode can be definitely challenging or just plain annoying. Next up is killing Telos above 100% in rage. Now, Telos P5 is no joke. It's rather easy pre 150% in rage apparently if you just onslaught in the green beam and you don't have red minions. If you know what you're doing, it isn't per se hard, but you need the extra food you save by being skilled in P1, 2, 3 and possibly 4 to easily make it through P5 if you're really bad at Telos like me. Because otherwise you'll be running out of food, and I have a few clutch kills that I will be showing on screen. The thing is, if you have the virus, you need to clear it, and you need to run away from the green beam to the red beam, for example. The minions can stun you. You sometimes first kill the minions to negate the damage, or you just use devotion and just tank it. Use the green beam and unlimited adrenaline to finish off Telos. Out of all of the bosses in the A tier list, I personally find, at least at the moment, before I can do P1 to P4 with almost no food, Telos 100% and up to be the hardest boss in this tier. That will change over time, however, once I get better at resing, let's say, the hold steals, countering the Gillenor uppercuts, which are pretty easy to counter actually. I can already do that. And just save food and have more food for P5 so I can munch through that. Now next is definitely a high tier solo boss. You need to know the mechanics, you need to know how to do decent damage for blood phase, otherwise you will not be able to get a successful kill, and it's really difficult and frustrating when you're trying to learn X to counter the blood phase, maybe countering the ice prisons depending on your reaction time. They really aren't that hard if you put resonance on your action bar and freedom keybinded. But yeah, they can be difficult for you if you're new to PVM. It was the first high tier boss I tried to solo. Luckily, before I tried soloing, I did 100 kills duo, which definitely helped me out. And a friend of mine, Slippy, learned me most of the mechanics of the boss before I even tried to do it solo. So I only died 1 or 2 times trying to attempt solo, and I finally got kills and just got better from there. Learning solo Nex is a very good option if you're looking to make money and get into high tier PVM, because Nex can easily be 7.5 million GP per hour, up to 10 million GP per hour depending on your luck with the drops. Let's say if you get a lot of Torva pieces, you're going to be making bank, and this is a perfect boss for that. Next up, we have the entirety of Elite Dungeons 1. Now, these bosses are definitely A tier bosses, because even I still now at this point struggle with these bosses. I really don't like Elite Dungeons 1. I think it's a rather annoying dungeon and the worst dungeon, but it is definitely a challenge. And if you like challenges, well, try Elite Dungeons 1. Even the trash mobs hit hard, and I've been killed by the trash mobs every now and then, especially the ones leading up to Masuta, the second boss, which is a bit awkward, dying to trash mobs. But these bosses are no joke, and neither is Elite Dungeon 1. Now, the first boss, being the Sanctum Guardian, is, in my opinion, the most annoying boss of Elite Dungeons 1. Because it has a beam attack which goes around, and it has smoke which he places every now and then. And that smoke can really clutter up the fighting arena, and at some point it's just too annoying to run around it because you'll take so much damage that you need to start rezzing the beam to avoid the attack, but then minions spawn and they can snipe your res, and maybe it's just my lack of skill when killing this boss because I haven't killed him very often solo. Duo trio he's fine, but solo this boss is extremely annoying in my opinion, and definitely worthy of that A tier because I just eat a lot of food here, and if you don't know the mechanics, you can easily get stacked out with the beam and the smoke. He also hits very hard with his melee splash attack similar to the Claudia Beach event boss. The second boss is probably the boss a lot of other people hate the most, but I don't find him that bad. Masuta is however a very difficult boss to solo. He hits extremely hard and you need to pay attention 100% of the time or he will spin you to death's office. Now, I won't speed up the clips on purpose to show you what I'm doing, but his spin attacks are rather easily countered by using Debilitate or Devotion to negate the damage while praying melee. At some point in the fight, he actually starts spawning little whirlpools or whirlwinds, water or something. They shoot at you with magic attacks. And if you're not praying magic, the hits can definitely add up. And if your DPS is too low, he will actually leave a few alive to keep hitting you after he starts attacking you again. So you gotta watch out for that because they can stack you out if you're not paying attention. Now, killing Masuta with melee is probably the hardest. I think with ranged and magic you can just kite him around and he really isn't that bad. And for the final portion of the fight, he's really easy, just hits very hard with his magic attack and ranged attacks if you're not using deflect or pray against ranged and magic. You want to switch to magic when he uses his purple smoke attack thing. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but yeah, the final portion of the fight is probably the easiest. It's just a matter of switching your prayers or curses up and just killing him. And the final boss being Seryu also has a lot of mechanics. He's rather annoying, he takes a long time to kill, at least for me. You need to kill the crystals on his back or destroy them and then keep the blobs from getting to him and healing him. And all in all, he's just not a very fun boss to kill, and I'm not entirely sure how hard this would be without tier 90s, as I've never tried and I have no interest in trying, but I'm sure if you're a lower level player, just mid-level player, you're not maxed out, you will have a lot of trouble killing this boss because he's a mechanic heavy and DPS heavy boss. Dominion Mines of course will help you a lot with the crystals, but I'm sure not everyone will have those. I don't even have those myself because I'm lazy. And with that being said, that's all the A tier bosses. Now let's move on to S tier bosses. And so we arrive at the S tier bosses. For S tier we have Talos 500% Enrage and up, Barrow's Rise of the 6 solo, which is extremely hard and you need to have very good DPS and full knowledge of the mechanics, Araxor 300% Enrage, and soloing Ambassador, the final boss of Elite Dungeons 3. Now, since I'm not really at that point of S tier PVM just yet because I haven't tried and practiced enough, so the footage you'll be seeing on screen is actually from another YouTuber and streamer who is extremely good at PVM and has mastered the combat system and is flawless at bossing, especially at Telos, Evil Lucario. If you're interested in actual high tier PVM content, go and check his channel out, linked in the description below. On screen now is a Rise of the 6 solo, and this is incredibly impressive, and I wouldn't even attempt this because I know my DPS isn't good enough for this. Even duo, it's not easy to do a duo Rise of the 6 kill per se. The kills are fast, especially in 4-man, but this is a solo. So you can imagine how difficult it actually is. Now, before making this video, I discussed this tier list with a few friends, but also with Evil Lucario to see what his opinion was on the higher end bosses. And in his opinion, as one of the top 0.1%, probably one of the best PVMers in the game, there's only a handful of people that can actually do 4K Telos, for example. He would say that 500% Telos is the hardest boss on this list, then Rise of the 6 solo, then 300% Enrage Araxor, and then Ambassador solos. The footage you're seeing on screen is a 500% Enraged kill of Talos. I'll switch that to a 4000% Enraged kill of Talos in just a bit. 500% Enraged Talos is hard in itself. Imagine 4000% Enraged for the Gold Warden title, which he of course has, and it's just super impressive that people are able to do this. It just requires so much dedication, absolute mastery of the combat system, all of the abilities and the boss's mechanics, and a bit of RNG and luck because the hit chance is lower on a higher range of Telos. the clip you're seeing on screen of 4000 Enraged Telos is actually one using food, but he also has a video on his YouTube channel doing 4000% Enraged Telos without using food. And with that being said, I think that pretty much concludes and explains the solo boss tier list for RuneScape 3. I know there's some quest bosses like Nomad and the Abomination thing that I didn't include, but I did include those on purpose. With that being said though, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you did, please leave a like down below and maybe even consider subscribing. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.